Hello, everyone. I'm Barb Chamberlain, use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Active Transportation Division for the Washington State Department of Transportation. Welcome again to the Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit. Very happy to have you with us for this 4-day virtual event, and always thrilled to see folks from so many communities around the state and beyond joining us. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual, and those participating are joining us from many lands. Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes are two statewide organizations and acknowledge the land that their offices in the Puget Sound sit on today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Squamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose lands you're on, look in the chat in a minute where you'll find a link to a map you can use to look up your place on the land. Without these communities and these people, we would not have access to this environment. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of the land who are still here with us. We'd also like to note that we are recording this session and it will be available following the summit. The summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of a safe and healthy future where bicycles bring people together, eliminate inequity, and create thriving communities. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 14 panels with expert speakers, with registration free for all attendees. Thank you to the Washington State Department of Transportation, Columbia Bank, and Darrow. I'll now introduce the session, our panelists, and the topic. We have with us today Representative Marcus Riccelli of Spokane, Charlene Kay with WashDOT, Rowena Pineda with the Environmental Justice Council, Spokane City Council President Brian Beggs, and Shauna Harshman with the Spokane Low Income Housing Coalition. We're going to be discussing the ways in which we can institutionally change the outcomes in transportation infrastructure. Using the context of Spokane and the East Central neighborhood, our panelists will discuss the impacts and consequences of highway expansion on underserved communities, as well as how we can move forward to create more just systems. From the HEAL Act to environmental justice, we'll investigate the paths forward to create more equitable and resilient communities. We'll have a few minutes of introduction and then presentation and Q&A. Please keep dropping your questions into the chat, and we'll get to those as we get through the session and wrap in about 90 minutes total. With that, I want to provide a few opening sort of framing comments for folks who aren't as familiar with Spokane. And I used to live there, and the place that I lived is represented on this map. This is a 1936 redlining map of Spokane and the area of the East Central neighborhood. As we talk about the intersections of climate justice, racial equity, and highway expansion, the North Spokane corridor is a case study to talk about how we can and must center the communities that are most impacted by these expansions and create systems that build more just and resilient places. The North Spokane corridor was first conceived in 1946 as an alternative north-south route through Spokane. Ground was first broken in 2001 after the legislature funded it in 2000. What I'm showing now is a map that gives the context of the entire corridor and then drilling in on the neighborhoods around where I-90 and the North Spokane corridor come together. At completion, the project will connect to US 395 and US 2 and connect to I-90. The QR code on the screen takes you to a story map that WashDOT has created to give you more information about the place. The neighborhood that the North Spokane corridor bisects is East Central. That's one of Spokane's most diverse neighborhoods and a hub for Black culture. This neighborhood was first bisected by highways when I-90 development displaced thousands of residents. And the pictures on the screen now are postcards and articles from the time when there was a park that ran through this whole area. Construction of the North Spokane corridor has reopened historical wounds for residents. The context of I-90's construction has created a history of disproportionate harms of past development, and transportation experts are hoping to mitigate current and future impacts of highway development and expansion. The images on the screen now show you the actual I-90 construction and what we have there today. WashDOT was pleased to partner with the City of Spokane to apply for a RAISE grant that we recently were awarded. This will fund planning to reconnect the East Central neighborhood with an active transportation bridge over I-90. And on the screen now, you see an aerial of the area as it is now, a conceptual picture of what it could look like, and an image, I believe that's our land bridge over in Vancouver, to give you an idea of what a connection could become. The project is a case study for how we move our state toward the more equitable and sustainable future, centering communities most impacted in these types of projects. And we'll be dropping links in the chat to the story map of the project and also our RAISE grant application, which gives you some more information. With that, I am going to stop my screen share and ask our panelists to come on screen and introduce themselves. And let me just make sure I have really ended my screen share. Somebody want to say, yes, it's gone. It's gone. All right, super. Just to make sure you're not seeing all the flailing around. So I will ask folks to introduce themselves and give the context of why you're in this conversation. What's your relationship to the project and the neighborhood, and how your office or role or agency interacts with this project and the future of the community. I'm going to start with Representative Riccelli, and after that, we'll go to Shar, Rowena, Brian, and Shauna. So Representative Riccelli, why are you with us today?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. Hopefully my audio is coming in, and just give me the thumbs up sign and let me know if I'm won't go too long here. But so I represent the 3rd District in Spokane, Washington, which is, the area that was bisected by I-90, the East Central area. These are folks in the community. These are my employers. And this is a really broad community conversation. Conversation around the North Spokane corridor completion has been going on for many, many years. I've been involved in that. I serve on our transportation committee in the House. I was part of some of the work on the initial package a few years back. And on this recent package, I was one of the transportation negotiators as we look to kind of rethink how we do transportation in Washington State. But this has been such an impactful conversation to really have the real history of the initial project and the community be told, and then how we can do a much better job with community engagement, and how we can do a much better job about doing our best to undo past wrongs, which we know we can never fully do, but we can make sure voices are front and center that have been left out of the conversation. And actually, I'm hopeful that I will do a lot of listening and then acting on behalf as folks from the communities that are most impacted are leading those conversations and helping shape the policy ideas, but not just the policy ideas. We know really a budget is a reflection of our values as a state. So where we're actually putting dollars to actually impact communities going forward. So I guess I'll leave it at that. And I'm just very grateful to be part of this conversation. It's an important conversation for our community, but it's also an important community conversation for our state as we look to move forward across the state with transportation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charlene Kay, and I serve as Eastern Region's Planning and Strategic Community Partnerships Director. I'm excited to be here with you because it's after 36 years of working at WashDOT and 36 years of knowing that the North Spokane corridor was well underway, that we are now at a time, last few years, where the time has really come where we could really look at really addressing some of the historic harms that have occurred because of transportation improvements. I serve as a lead in engaging communities and really looking at how we can leverage a transportation improvement project, or I would say not improvement project, but a mobility project to better serve and provide access in and around communities. It's after these many years that we do have now in place at both at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level, an opportunity to really look at restoration and correction of past harms and leveraging transportation initiatives to do so. We haven't had this time before. It's a great time for WashDOT to be able to seize this moment. And when that moment arrived, we had leadership in place that said, yes, let's take it on. And it is a new horizon for us. It's all new work for us. But we are really excited about the partnerships that we've had in and around the Spokane community to help us with this, our city of Spokane, the various neighborhoods that Barb pointed out. And so I'm excited to talk with you about where we have been, where we intend to go, and the ongoing efforts of really restoring bifurcation that's happened in and around the NSC and also the I-90 area.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rowena Pineda. Thank you for having me today. I am part of the team that is staffing the Environmental Justice Council. The Environmental Justice Council is an advisory body that was created as part of the Healthy Environment for All Act, or the HEAL Act, which passed the legislature in 2021. The HEAL Act really centers environmental justice in policymaking, as well as in budgets and grants that state agencies are working on. And it also centers community voice. There's a community engagement is a big part of HEAL. So I work primarily with the agencies that are implementing the HEAL Act. So there are 7 of them, including the Department of Transportation. So I work closely with SHAR, as well as the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Ecology, Health, Natural Resources, and the Puget Sound Partnership. Prior to joining the Environmental Justice Council staff, I worked at the Spokane Regional Health District, which is actually the perspective that I bring more closely to this conversation. In that capacity, I managed a program called Neighborhoods Matter, and our geographic region starting out was East Central, and the impact on maternal and child health in East Central. And the creation of the freeway, the I-90 freeway, has already been alluded to, dissected that community in half, which then had impacted the health of that community. And one of the projects that I did when I was there is a historical project of the impact of the I-90 freeway on the neighborhood. So I'm going to stop there, and probably we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Brian Begg, Spokane City Council President, and I first came to Spokane in 1981, and we were talking about the North-South Freeway back then, many years ago. And here it is, about to be a reality with a new name, new design, a lot of new bells and whistles. But my background before I was on City Council is I've been a lawyer for over 30 years, mostly representing people without much voice or power in the status quo, and mostly suing government to try to get some voice and do social change. I do a lot of community education and advocacy. And so I bring that lens to this conversation. I am a frequent user of trails for running, and I'm an occasional bicycle commuter around town. And I spent a couple years running the Spokane City Council's Sustainability Committee and was deeply involved in our new Sustainable Action Plan for Spokane. So I kind of have that lens as well. Council President, a big part of my job is to create space for as many voices as possible to participate in the process and to bring accurate information to people that they can utilize. So I spend a lot of my professional time trying to figure out how to engage people and help them feel heard, but also live in the reality that the society is what it is. And there's a lot of structural inequity that's just there. And in this particular dynamic, even though the city is part of the government, we're sort of the very junior partners of the state. And so we're trying to figure out how to work those relationships for our neighborhoods and the entire city. And I find that interesting. Really, if there's a theme in my professional career, it's how to have influence beyond the formal power or money that your group has. So I'll leave it there.
That's a hard one to follow, Brian. Shauna Harshman. In my current position, I am the Director of Right-of-Way Housing with the Spokane Low-Income Housing Consortium. More specifically, that means that I'm working with them on the Camp Hope project, which is located on Washtop property in the vicinity of that NSC connection. Prior to that, however, I was manager of neighborhood connectivity with Brian and with Spokane City Council. And in that regard, I worked closely with the East Central neighborhood in a number of planning capacities, working with the Fifth Avenue group, working with Sharkey in that raise grant application for the land bridge across I-90 to reconnect that community. And previously, I have been involved in the placemaking work with Sharkey along the NSC. So I've been working in some regards in this project area since 2016. And personally, to bring it home, I am an East Central resident as well, and happen to reside in a home that looks out over our I-90 infrastructure. So from the personal all the way up to the professional, I am centered in this neighborhood, in this project area vicinity. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Super. Thank you all. We have such a great panel to have a really robust conversation. And I'm going to rotate through who gets put on the spot first with our questions. And folks can, if you don't have something you want to add, you can always take a pass or chime in. The next question I want to ask is, what, from your perspective, is the relationship between this highway creation expansion with climate justice and racial equity? And I'll throw that first to Rowena and then invite the others to chime in.
Great, thank you, Barb. I would like to start off by defining environmental justice, because I think that's important in this conversation. And my apologies if I look sideways, because I have to look at my notes. So environmental justice means the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, rules, and policies. Environmental justice includes addressing disproportionate environmental and health impacts in all laws, rules, and policies by prioritizing vulnerable populations and overburdened communities, the equitable distribution of resources and benefits, and eliminating harm. So, as I'm sure Sharkey will talk in a little bit, the expansion of the interstate highway system throughout the country has disproportionately harmed communities of color. As you could see when Barb showed that redlining map of Spokane, there's very close similarity to where the north-south corridor is going and where the I-90 freeway is. That is not an accident. That is a policy. So the red line communities, to speak a little bluntly, was expendable. And so we built freeways across those. And this is not unique to Spokane. This is a pattern throughout the country. And so I think what we're doing right now, as I'm sure Sharkey will also talk about, is we're mitigating the impact that's already fallen and disproportionately impacted those different communities. From my public health perspective, as I said before, having worked in East Central, and also where the north-south freeway is, we know that those are the very same communities that have higher incident rates of chronic diseases and also have lower life expectancy. And again, that's not an accident. These are policies. You know, we created policies, but we also have the power to create policies to mitigate those. And we can't really, we can't undo I-90. I-90 is there, we depend on it. But we can be more thoughtful about how we engage communities, especially the communities that are much more impacted, who are primarily really communities of color, in decision-making processes that impact them. So we really need to be asking ourselves, when we're looking at some of these policies, whether it's transportation related or any other policies that's related to environment, we need to be asking who's benefiting, who's being harmed. And as we look at policies that have harmed, how are we mitigating? So I'm going to leave it there and pass it to the next person, Barb.
Thank you, Rowena. And I'd like to add on, as you look at the earlier map that Barb shared, there are 5 neighborhoods, including East Central, that actually are in and around the North Spokane corridor I-90. And all of those neighborhoods are all environmental justice population, Spokane's highest environmental justice population communities. And as Rowena pointed out, we know that it was not by happenstance that transportation corridors, and I want to point out transportation corridors, the rail line that extends north and south of Spokane, that actually has a lot of residents that migrated in and around the rail line, and the rail line was further expanded, lived in and around these communities. So that was a pre-existing transportation corridor. And of course, the impacts that occurred across the nation with the induction of the interstate across the nation, primarily affecting communities of color, as Rowena previously stated. And acknowledging that has occurred, I think it's very important for us to really understand, as we're developing projects, looking at practical solutions, modifying how we use prior design standards to provide reduced footprints in those areas that have already been predetermined, and to the extent that we could reduce, minimize. And then of course, I think it's very important that we invest in leveraging these transportation projects for redevelopment in and around the areas that have been historically impacted, and that will be reside in and around corridors such as North Spokane corridor and the interstate, towards mitigation and ensuring that in all of this work, that it is community centered. We have to acknowledge that we weren't always community centered in the past, siting of facilities. And because we weren't, what can we do today that will demonstrate that we are genuine from this point forward? We have an opportunity to look forward to be more community centered in our approach to addressing transportation, not just for regional mobility needs, but also for access in and around the communities in which these facilities actually will reside ultimately.
Looks like I'm up. For me, I look at a lot of from the social determinants of health, and I work part-time in a community health clinic, looking at public health, looking at the impacts, whether people can walk, they can have access, whether or not there's air pollution that's kicked up, and how that all impacts community residents. And I think from a health perspective, we already know that our communities of color are disproportionately impacted with a lot of our social determinants of health. And so I really want to, be a voice as the representative to take the message when we talk about, of the community. I love the placemaking that's going on. I love the fact that we need to be held accountable for our decisions. And as a, representing state government, not just our actions going forward, our actions, our historical actions that we took, and how can we do things better? What are the policy interventions that we can put in place? But really, I think what's important for me is just really getting that engagement, so that we're not saying, here's the table that's set, but we have a decision that's already been made that we're going to try and force feed folks, versus the opposite, which is that grassroots community impact, that we carry a message as elected officials, as community leaders, that is the message for our community. And that's what I'm really interested in and excited about, and that's what I'm very hopeful for. But we know there's a lot of barriers that are in place institutionally that we need to remove, and hopefully conversations like this can be conduits to really removing those barriers and ensuring that we have a fair treatment for folks, and that we're not just trying to right past wrongs, but we're going above and beyond to actually change the way we do business.
I'm going to be really brief because of all of the wonderful things that other people have already said. But when I'm thinking about the relationship between the NSC and its expansion, I'm also thinking about how I-90 came to be. And I'm drawing those contrasts between the way that I-90 came to be and the way that the NSC is rolling out, and paying particular attention to what Marcus and Shar and Rowena are saying about learning those lessons, both in terms of community engagement and the work that we do with the neighborhoods, and being authentic, so that we know that we cut off access and we divided a community when we installed I-90. So learning from that, how do we do better with the NSC? Well, that's what we're doing by providing Children of the Sun Trail and looking not just at that particular facility that is the freeway, but how others access both multimodally with bikes and pedestrians, either side of that facility and north-south. And so taking those lessons and applying them to the transportation system we want of the future, and doing the best that we can to ensure the voices are at the table and that we're providing better access for all users. And that's the perspective that I'm bringing to this.
And I'll just add that regardless of what people think about this project, there's going to be some really strong competition of values that people bring to it. And I think it makes it really challenging to come to decisions, because you're not going to change that. I mean, there are people who are going to pay a big price for this, no matter how much mitigation you do. And there are people who are going to get a lot of benefit from it, no matter how much you charge them for it as taxpayers. And I don't think that you really resolve. It's just such a huge impact. And I had a colleague on city council the last few years who was convinced, and I think reasonably, that this is always going to be a bad outcome for their neighborhoods that they represented. Like, there was no way to mitigate it to make it a good outcome, a good benefit for them. And yet, there was no way it was going to be stopped. And because there's certain values, well, we've invested this much time and money, why would we stop now? Or it's, creating good jobs is the highest priority over the health outcomes for the people who live by it. And that's going to be the challenge. And, the legislature and the executive branch are going to make their value judgments on those kinds of trade-offs. But I think what we can do is look for overlapping interests, and we can spend a lot of time on that. Well, if there is going to be this impact, and I've heard this from Shar and other people, that it's not just a matter of, okay, we feel bad for I-90, but really we're going to do this project differently, and we'll find some overlapping interests, and we will spend the money necessary to really reduce the negative impacts. And the whole piece about climate justice and racial equity lenses are to ask those questions and bring those questions to the table and ask them and get the data out on the table about what is the life expectancy in these neighborhoods and why is that? And what do we know about what will happen? And so I think it's a start, but I think it's always going to be challenging for the neighborhoods that are going to be impacted, because they're going to say, well, you had some outreach and yeah, we got to say what we wanted, but you still did it. And I think one thing that I find helpful is we do just have to tell people the truth, is that it's coming, it's going to be a big impact, and yet we can argue about it. And just to give you a real-time argument that's going on right now is trying to spend some extra money to get more on-ramps and off-ramps in the neighborhoods that are most impacted. Right now, the freeway is going to go through them without a lot of access. And so they're like, wait a second, we're going to pay this huge price and we don't even get to use it. But that's I forget what it is, a $30 million or $40 million increase in the price tag. And are we going to step up and spend that to at least give people in the neighborhood access?
Thanks so much, all of you. Several of you mentioned community engagement, which conveniently is the topic of our next planned question. because this is so important, that engaging with and responding to community needs is a really critical element of building towards equity, really foundational. And this one, I'll ask Shar first what it really means to engage with the community and how we do that outreach in a way that is meaningful.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to first share that we know that relationships are very key, and I did not share earlier, but I do have almost a lifelong relationship with East Central community since the time I came to Spokane in 1986. And throughout many of our years, my children both went through and attended the community center at East Central. Most of my social activities were in East Central. Even though I didn't reside, many folks think that I actually grew up in East Central because I spent a lot of time there. However, the remaining neighborhoods, I did not spend a lot of time in prior to actually being a part of the North Spokane corridor. However, once I learned of the neighborhoods, I really took time on my own regard and really start to learn and build relationships with members in community beyond my work with WSDOT. What were some of the interests that they had, some of the goals that they had for their communities, spending time at their community meetings outside of WSDOT initiatives, really developing genuine relationships. And so I found it was very important, and it's important in many aspects when we're dealing with folks who may not, because of valid reasons, have trust in government, really to engage with people where they are. Often we actually hold 9-to-5 meetings and we expect people to come in our tent doors and say, come meet with us. However, on the North Spokane corridor project and our reset of a developing place in and around the North Spokane corridor, we actually went into communities and identified, based on what they shared with us, their gathering places. And based on those gathering places, we set up listening posts, we set up storefronts in Northeast Community Center, East Central Community Center, Fred Meyer's, where people knew that they could come and meet with us and share ideas, interests, and concerns that they may have around the North Spokane corridor. And then ultimately we hosted a series of charrettes, many of which were actually on the weekend, because we asked people, when is the best time that we could meet with you? And surprisingly to many, it was not 9-to-5, because people hold jobs that they can't take leave from. So they said the best time to meet with them was on a Saturday. So we met on a midday Saturday for 6 or 7 hours. Shauna was a part of that. Rowena was a part of that on occasion. And we spent time meeting with people, and they informed the remaining 5 miles, informed the remaining 5 miles of the Children of the Sun Trail, and also the establishment of the infrastructure in and around the North Spokane corridor. To Councilmember Breen's point, it was very important for us, and in order to establish trust and transparency, to identify those things that were given to us as opportunities to influence, that the community can influence, and then be really clear about those things that we did not have as community members an opportunity to influence. So for instance, with the North Spokane corridor community at the time of our re-engagement did not have an opportunity to influence where the alignment would go. However, as changes occurred, we were able to open up that engagement again to allow community members to have influence. So really being clear and transparent about how the community's input would be used. We actually developed a funnel diagram, and we said, hey, we know you're going to give us a lot of ideas. You've been waiting for this. However, we know because of current financial constraints, we may not be able to implement all of these things. It doesn't mean that they're not good ideas. Still give us your good ideas. We'll figure out if there's the ability to bring those to fruition in the future. We're going to hold on to that, but there are certain things that transportation dollars currently cannot be spent on. And so the community understood that. And after a while, we had champions in the room that could say, oh no, transportation dollars can't be spent on that, but we can get dollars somewhere else. We can try to get dollars somewhere else. So I say that community engagement outreach at the crust of it is tailoring it to meet the needs of the people that you want to be involved. And we want everyone to be involved, and particularly those who are affected, potentially affected by a decision or a project.
Oh, Brian, I think you meant to talk and you're muted.
You're correct. I think I'm supposed to go next. I wanted to just spotlight something Shar said, and also that she lives, and that is the importance of establishing relationships and getting to know people just for the sake of that, for their value in the community. And I've watched Shar from afar in this process, and she does that. And you heard those words. I just think that's so important. So often, people in government are a little more checking the box of like, okay, we held a hearing, you know, we had a survey. But what she was talking about, and I just want to emphasize the importance, is no, I want to know you because you live in this neighborhood, and that's important to me, regardless of what we figure out about this project. I just want to know you, and I want to know your perspective. And to the degree that people pick up that sense of it, that's gonna mean a lot. You know, we all say community engagement's important, and it is. It's critically important. I think your average person in the community is going to say, well, you know, you listened to me physically, you had your meeting, but did you hear me? Did you hear us? What are our real needs and interests? And even to go beyond that is something that agencies can do is to help people even understand their interests. So often people gather around one particular item, and that becomes symbolic of them wanting to have agency in their community, and agency meaning the power to control their destiny. So they'll pick something. It's just a position, really. But one thing I think an agency can do is to help people understand deeply what is important to them, really, not just yay or nay on this particular bridge design, but what is really underlying, what values does that community have, and giving them to the ability to control their own destiny to the degree possible. So I think it's important to let people know that. And one just thought I had while I was listening and thinking about today is signposting when the community did influence the outcome. So there's certain things they can't, but having the list of, you know, this is what we were going to do. This was the layout. This was the trail. This was the name. And this is what we heard from you and why. And so we went this way, so that you can tell that story both to give yourself more credibility as an agency, but also to empower people to know that, no, it really does make a difference. See, it did make a difference there. It can make a difference again if I speak my truth. And so I guess want to spotlight that engagement is because we value the people involved, and it's also to the best of our ability within the law and budgets to give them agency to influence their own destinies and their own communities.
I think I just would like to highlight one piece that Shar and Brian both touched on, which is the importance, I think, of the continuous reinforcing feedback loop between the project and the community members, that people do need to see that the voice that they have has impacted the project, and they need to see that continuously throughout the cycle of the project. And I think too often projects will look for community engagement, and then that gets noted, and then the project moves on without that feedback loop to let the community know what impact their voice has had. And I think that is one of the most meaningful things that we can do throughout the duration of a project, to to engage with the community members and build that trust is to never let there be a black hole, and to always bring them along with us as we're taking this journey, so that they don't forget about it. They're not wondering 2 years later, oh yeah, what did happen to that placemaking effort? And so I think that with some of the documents that have been posted in the chat for you to take a look at, the story map and the project page, that this project is really attempting to have that feedback loop. And I look forward to seeing how this continues and how it plays out in the end.
I'd like to add a few things. I think the way that we engage is so critical, and that institutions who are rethinking the way they do business is critical. For me, like some of the things that were already mentioned, but the timing of when meetings occur, is there childcare availability? Are they on transit lines so it's accessible? Now, not just because of health reasons, as there's, access for online participation. We saw that in the legislature. That changed the way that we do business to get online feedback, even if it's just somebody checking a why or no in if they're in favor or something. But I'd really want to get back to a little bit what Brian said about, we look for these big wins to gather momentum. But I think, these are difficult times, and trust is built through a lot of little actions and a lot of follow through. And quite frankly, government, which is all of us, needs to not only share when we do right by successfully implementing a change that has come from the folks directly impacted, but we really need to embrace that. A robust democracy can only exist with an active and engaged citizenry. We're losing a lot of that right now. But what I will also say, what's difficult for a lot of people in this very yes, no type world, is that hearing folks and acting doesn't mean that there's only success if you get 100% of what you come to the table for. And that's very difficult in this day and age. So I really think showing where those impacts are being made, communicating back. A hard thing that I deal with is that people call my office for casework. Maybe they're having difficulty with an agency, and we actually have pretty high success in that. What I'd say though, what's frustrating is how many people know how to find the number for their elected official. I can't tell you the number of times people say, this is the first time I've ever made a call. So I know that there's thousands of people out there that want to engage in that way. And we need to really make sure we're, like I think Shar said, meeting people where they're at to be successful. And that's on all of us, and not just say we're listening to listen, but hear people.
So I think I do the summary piece for this one. So I just want to reinforce that what I heard from the panel, which is that relationships are important, because trust is based on relationships, and that we need to be transparent in the process. And I know that Washat tries to do this with the work Sharkey is doing, which is like engaging people from even when we're scoping a project all the way to the end of the project. And as Shauna mentioned, how do we keep looping people back as we move forward in a process? And really just being clear about setting expectations on when we are engaging with communities. The thing I wanted to add is really the importance of power sharing with communities. All of us here representing government have power. And so how do we share that in a meaningful and authentic way with communities is important. And also, I think that we, at least as part of the HEAL Act, the agencies are trying not to be extractive of communities. Sometimes we go to communities multiple times. Different agencies will be like, I need you for this, I need you for that, I need you for this. How do we avoid it? And it is up to government to how do we coordinate the way we engage with communities a little bit more, so we're not asking them multiple times for their feedback. So how do we do that? And I think that's one of those ongoing challenge that we just have to work through.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't share and say with the North Spokane quarter placemaking, our initial kickoff meeting, I believe we had about 400 people there, and we actually seized that opportunity to bring in SRT, Spokane Regional Transportation Council, Spokane Transit Authority, and I believe one or two other organizations who actually had initiatives that they wanted to share with community members. And so we hosted it at Spokane Community Colleges, and all of the organizations were able to engage with those who participated in the place engagement. But another point that came to mind for me really is connecting the dots of leveraging the work that you're doing. And so with the community engagement efforts that we are all partnering with around the North Spokane corridor, the engagement is really resulting in a greater awareness of what community wants in and around the North Spokane corridor. And because of that, the city of Spokane and their staff are able to leverage that. And there are projects that are city-initiated projects that are being implemented because of what staff have heard during the meetings. And so I think it's incumbent on us as agencies really to connect those dots and say that because we heard you here, we were able to leverage and bring about a bigger initiative. And so there are connections, access connections, supporting trail alignments along Illinois Avenue that community spoke of and now is underway. All of those are because of the small acorn, I would say, that's turned into a bigger tree. And we're continuing to connect those dots, and hopefully through the story map, we'll be able to show the connections and the fruits of communities' work and engaging.
Thank you for that, Shar and Rowena. I hear you on we want to ask you our questions and somebody else wants to ask you their questions, and we're going to just keep coming at you. I have one more question for the panel, and then I want to invite folks who are listening to drop yours into the chat, and I saw one, so for sure, so get that ball rolling. And this one is we're at an inflection point with a lot of new policies and tools. We have the HEAL Act, we have more and more data all the time, and new ways of coming together online, for example. How does that change how we do the work? And what do you think the real outcomes would be of these tools and frameworks? And how do we bring all of that into this project and into others as well? And I will invite Representative Riccelli to pick us off with that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think from the outside, sometimes people say, oh, great, a policy to coordinate, a bunch of other agencies, we're just increasing bureaucracy. But I really think it was a monumental step, because it puts front and center this idea of eliminating some of the health disparities among communities of color and low-income households. And I've seen it impact already. We developed the transportation package last year, last session, and just the way that it puts it front and center. It also sets goals for, investments, and that's really powerful, actually. Again, I think it's really important when we bring forward policy interventions. But again, I'll say it, I think a budget is a reflection of our values as a state. So where we actually invest our dollars is really the biggest policy intervention that we can have, in my opinion. And if we're not in tune, if we're not coordinated, if we're not thinking about these types of things front and center, it gets parsed out. It doesn't seem strategic. And so I think others on this panel can speak much better to this, but what I'll say, it is powerful. It's powerful to have a tool in the toolbox that now has this idea of treating everybody fairly and making sure that we're addressing our vulnerable communities and making that front and center. So I think it's very powerful. I think what the metrics are, how we live up to that goal now, is really important, and we need to have that mirror up, because it could be, and then we could just end up doing the opposite, losing faith in government even further if we don't follow through on this. So I do think the stakes are high, that we have to deliver now on what has been brought forward, and that takes a lot of work. It's a huge investment in time and in funding, and just in the direction we're headed as a state. So I think there's some others on this panel that could probably even drill home more, but I just wanted to set that tone for this kind of overarching, that it is actually important. We see these types of measures that can be, you know, blank pieces of paper in the end of the day, and then we see things that can actually have fundamental transformational change. I have a lot of hope in this, but it will also take a lot of work, and we need to remain committed, and we also have to make sure that we're accountable to our community, that we're bringing this forward.
This is Brian. I think Sean and I are going to go next. Just from a local standpoint, I have two things really to talk about. So the first is when we have these new tools, whether they're new laws, new data, new ways of imaging things, those are all super helpful and great. And the question is, who gets to benefit from those? And like everything else in our society, you know, it tends to be wealthier, more powerful people, whiter people, more men than women, and all these people who are more conforming to social standards that tend to have that. And so I think a lot of the work for government is, and especially local government, is to figure out how to empower communities that are historically excluded, especially through an intersectional lens, to make use of those. Do they have that data? You know, can they make the argument? Too often, again, I said this before, but too often people argue from a positional situation, like I'm either for this or I'm against this, and we don't get to find out what their interests are. And the tragedy of that is that, one, they might not win the argument or the conversation, but secondly, that we miss out on opportunities where there could be common ground and common interests, and really everybody's lives could be better if we understood the interests. And so one thing we have in Spokane, we have an Office of Neighborhood Services, and we've divided our city into 29 neighborhoods. And that office has been better and worse funded over the years, but at its best, we have actually paid city staff that work with neighborhoods of people to empower them to better advocate for themselves with the city in different departments and different projects. And I really think that is a fundamental government service, is to empower people without regard to really whether you agree with what they're trying to do or not do, but just to give them the data and the tools to do it. And one thing I was happy with this last year, we partnered with Gonzaga's Leadership School to create an academy for neighborhood leaders on how to understand how city government works better and how to be more effective leaders in organizing community members. And we did it without regard to any specific issue. And a lot of that space is handled by nonprofit grassroots groups. But I just think it's great when the city invests in it too, outside of any particular issue, so that people have the benefit of those powerful data tools and even just ways of how to think about problem solving and interest-based solutions. So I want government to invest more in just empowering people, and especially with that lens of prioritizing the people who have been historically excluded.
Just building on that from a practitioner standpoint a little bit, I couldn't agree more with what you just said, Brian, in terms of the frameworks that are being presented at the state level, having the ability to really empower our communities. And I think that one of the one of the things that you'll hear when you talk to staff level people who are on the ground doing community engagement is cheers when the HEAL Act came forward, because practitioners know how important these things are, but they're not always well funded. Staffing resources is a very real resource. As Marcus said, our budget has a value, and when we place financial resources behind people who are doing this work, it's so very important. And so I think that on the ground, we're going to see much better, more equitable community engagement, because people are looking to the state now as setting the lead in what that looks like. I think one of the other things that's going to be really interesting is when we look at equitable community engagement, we are moving beyond checking the box and how many people showed up at your last open house or how many people came to this meeting. And we're now moving into an exciting era, which is new. And we're really just starting to look at measuring the quality of our community engagement. How did your relationship to government change after this project? How did your perception of the project change? Really getting into much more qualitative work to be able to look at how successful we are in reaching people, in messaging and discussing with them in ways that they understand, that they find are meaningful. And I think that as we move forward on this project and others along the North Spokane corridor, that we're going to see different metrics and different evaluation methods for measuring how well we're doing at engaging the community.
As I shared earlier, this is an exciting time, and I'm going to share as a WSDOT HEAL Act co-lead, and actually one who is now in the throes of really bringing environmental justice to the forefront based on the requirements of the HEAL Act. One of the most exciting things that I'm seeing with the new tools and frameworks that have been asked of us as an agency is that we are growing together. And I've said this often within our agency, it really is going to take a village. We're a very complex organization. That's not a secret to anyone. And we have many functional divisions, but we know that all of our divisions, from maintenance, our ferries, our project development, our construction division, all of us have a role and a hand to play in really addressing environmental justice. And so it really is exciting to see, as Shauna pointed out, our practitioners really stepping up and saying, hey, we want to learn more about this. How can we really promote or advocate change within our respective areas? And so I could say that we are currently growing together as with initiatives such as the HEAL Act. To Councilmember Brian Begg's point about our community members, I think one of the really great things of these new tools and initiatives is that it really supports a couple of things with our relationship with community, and that is it further helps support our transparency. Providing data and showing the results of our work as an agency is really going to show that as an agency, WSDOT is not only talking the talk, but we are walking the walk. And so we will have data to show that in our outcomes. That is very important, and we now have tools to do that. And so all of this at the end, I think at the end of the day, is going to hold not only our agency accountable, but also it will help support community in understanding how our agency operates, how to meander. That's one of the most challenging things that we hear from community is how do we meander organizations that are as complex as WSDOT? Well, what they don't know now, by the end of this process, we're hopeful that they'll know more about us, that the veil will be lifted and they'll be able to see these decisions were made with us, not to us. And so we're looking at opportunities from the onset of our scoping to embed meaningful and effective community engagement, not once the decision is made, but as the problem is identified with community. And so we have our practitioners are saying, hey, we can embed it here and we can do it better here. So I can't say it enough, is that it is an exciting time, and it's not a walk that we're taking as individuals in our agency. We're really doing it together collectively, and we really are expecting, I would say all of us are majority of us are expecting great things out of it.
Thank you. You know, the HEAL Act is it's a transformative piece of legislation in so many ways. And one of the reasons is, as Sharkey was just saying, is how it is changing the way agencies work internally, and how they're engaging with communities externally. And there are different components of HEAL, and it's not easy. It has its challenges for sure. But, you know, for the first time, the 7 HEAL agencies work together in drafting a community engagement plan across several agencies of different complexities, as Sharkey mentioned about DOT. We're also in the process of figuring out how to do environmental justice assessments for significant agency actions that includes budgets, grants, and loans that that agencies are going to be doing. And it's not easy because we don't quite have the tool. We're also figuring out what that tool could look like. And then there's different data points that we have to consider. And, you know, the HEAL Act named the Environmental Health Disparities Map as a tool that we would be using, but that is one tool. It is not the only tool. And there are limitations to the EHD map. The primary one being that the tribes who are not engaged in its development. And so the boundaries of that map may not be reflective, and it's not reflective of tribal boundaries. And so how do we then, you know, look at it, examine, and then review and redo in some ways the map itself. The other thing that's interesting, as a staff person working on HEAL, is also realizing that agencies are not necessarily, that data collection, for example, is not uniform across agencies. And so different agencies collect anything from demographic data to another data differently. And so part of it for us is also thinking about how do agencies then collect data in more uniform ways. So when Representative Ruccelli comes to me and says, give me the data for this, for all these agencies, we can actually pull the data and give you the most accurate data possible. But right now, we're still kind of working out how are different agencies collecting data. So those are interesting because they're challenging, but they have a lot of potential in really transforming how we as state government can be much more transparent in how we, you know, with the data we're giving to communities, with the data we're giving to our staff within these agencies. I mean, those are just important pieces. I'm going to stop there. Turn it back to you, Barb.
Great, thank you. We have some great questions coming in. And what I'm going to try to do is stay with the North Spokane corridor and the questions specific to that, and then ask you to bridge from what you've learned being in this community working on this project to have some advice for other locations. So starting with a North Spokane corridor question, what has been the biggest challenge or barrier to you in the work that you've done? What lessons have you learned that could inform how other communities might approach these kinds of projects? And I will just make that one a free-for-all. If you unmute, I'll figure you have something to add, and we can all see each other's microphone icons. So go for it. Lessons learned. And Char's not muted, so I think Char probably has thoughts on challenges or barriers.
Well, I could tell you, but I think I mean this is a minor one, but it was very important to the community. In our engagement with community members, we did not have or the ability to actually provide for daycare or food. So we were able to overcome that barrier by having a no-host daycare facility on site during the charrette, and literally went out and purchased, our staff personally purchased toys and made coloring sheets for kids and Legos for them to have on our own dime during the event. In regards to food, we were fortunate where the city of Spokane actually found a way to host and provide pizza. We now do have the support from our state legislature to be able to provide for daycare facilities, and we're working through that with the HEAL-AC Environmental Justice Working Group. But that was something that we didn't have afforded to us during that time frame.
Small but big. Representative Riccelli.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things of just kind of historically around engineering, et cetera, when we were talking about multimodal with the North Spokane corridor, it certainly for many years felt like an afterthought versus something to be front and center. I think that's been a real challenge to incorporate that and change that way of thinking. But I think we've seen that evolve over the years as minds have kind of changed and opened up to this is not just a corridor to move cars and trucks. How could this in the future be connectivity with trails for people living healthier, active lifestyles, et cetera. I think that was it. And then I certainly think the fact that it's such a big project that, you know, the support for completion, there was no in between, right? Like, so when you brought up changes and things like that, until we were able to get most of the full funding, it was like you're either fully 100% supportive of everything or you're against it. And there's a lot of gray area there in between where I think is in the really important areas to discuss and figure out. And then finally, I would just say, talking about design build is really difficult to communicate with the public. And so it's either like, well, this is how you're saying it's done, or this is how it's, you know, this is how it should be done, when that whole process is really set up to kind of improve and perfect along the way. And that's really challenging, particularly when there's been maybe not the highest trust because of the way things have been done previously.
You know, I was just going to chime in and try to bridge to Phil's question about the new corridor in Yakima, and that is, these things can seem so huge and large, like how could we ever figure out a way to influence at all? And I think Marcus gave good descriptions of like, yeah, there's possibilities, you can fractionalize the problem and figure out pieces of it. But the other thing is to look for allies. And I don't know the Yakima political situation, but you never know. It might be the local WSDOT office, it might be the state reps and state senate, it might be a county official, it might be the city council, it might be the health district. I served on the health district for 6 years here, and I was surprised to find out how interested they were in both active transportation and social determinants of health by zip codes and neighborhood transformation. So I think if you're concerned, you just got to scout around creatively and find allies, and then, you know, broader than just government. What are the nonprofits? I'm always looking for statewide nonprofits that might help us with a local problem here. But you just never know who's going to do it, because as Phil mentioned in his question, it doesn't seem like the project planning is following the existing law, and that's that's pretty typical, especially for projects outside the central Puget Sound, is that, yeah, no one's holding people accountable to it. So you got to find someone that can help on that.
Well, and Rowena?
Sorry, I think the one thing that I do just want to add, especially in the Yakima related question, is around engaging, especially engaging the Latinx community. And so language justice is really going to be big in that. And so making sure that interpretation is available during meetings, the translation of materials is being done. And in some cases, and going to where people are at. I'm always, you know, if it makes sense to do the meetings, to host the meetings and run it in Spanish, I will run it in Spanish, you know, and people who don't speak, who only speak English and don't speak Spanish, they can get interpreters for them. It's really coming where people are at. And in that particular community, I would think that language will be really important.
And I wanted to add also, often we're really confined initially with historic projects with funding, and also with the laws in which we operate. And if you really, believe that a path places you beyond the current finite funding ability, don't throw the idea away. Don't throw it away. Keep it alive, and really, continue to shop that idea, find other opportunities to explore, leveraging that idea towards fruition. I think quite often we kind of get stymied, or we feel like we hit a roadblock and we give up on really great dreams. And if we give up on it as agencies, then we're giving, in my mind, I feel like we're giving up on ideas of the community. And if we really believe that we can bring it to fruition, keep working it. And if that means legislative changes, go for it. If that means pursuing funding from various sources, or even the current source, pursue it. If it's really worth it, and it's really important for us. Rowena talked about it earlier, about our power that we have as governmental representatives to really act on behalf of those that we're serving. And so we found through our engagement effort that there were great, much needed ideas. And while it may not have been housed in one area, we found another entity that perhaps could pick it up and help us in pursuing it. And so really serve as an advocate. If you say you're going to be an advocate, be an advocate.
Great. And I'm wondering, Phil, if you could drop in, because you said local corridor. So if that is local government, they're not subject to the HEAL Act. And so if you add a little bit more detail for us to know that piece, it might point to some other statutes or regulations or ways to trigger that kind of engagement and meet some requirements that might be getting overlooked at this point. I loved Rena's suggestion that our public transportation division did an open house for the Human Services Transportation Plan that was held in Spanish. And if you needed English translation, that could be made available. But yeah, turn that dynamic around.
We had eight limited English proficiency that we provided for in all of our flyers, and prepared, didn't have to, but prepared to provide translation. And a great partner, also another great partner, is your school districts. Leverage the ability of school districts, or particularly schools in the respective neighborhoods that you're working at. They're great partners.
Yeah, some of our region offices have been found school districts that would partner in using their phone home program, because they know the dominant language of the household, and that they would push a message in whatever language is appropriate for that family to tell them something's going on. So some amazing partners out there. I want to make sure we touch on a question that we got about the encampment in East Central and the discussion around the future of the land there and what could happen for affordable housing and other facilities, and just talking about housing and housing affordability generally. And I might ask Shauna to get us going on that one, and then whoever else wants to chime in on that.
I think that this one is incredibly interesting in its complexity, but then looking backwards, how the agencies involved have really already been setting the stage for solutions for several years. So taking us back to the last legislative session, when there were some measures which will enable WashDOT to lease that additional right-of-way land that won't be needed for the North Spokane corridor for future affordable housing. So that has been in play now for a couple of years, working towards that idea that that's going to happen. And having talked with Shar, and Shar Kay will probably have more to say on this, but I know that she plans a very engaged process with the community in that neighborhood to identify what uses and what housing they would like to see and are important to them in that right-of-way land. So while we've got that happening in the background, we do currently have the encampment there, hundreds of people living on the WashDOT land. And where that is at is that WashDOT is a good partner with community agencies and with Department of Commerce in really trying to affect meaningful housing outcomes for the people that are encamped there currently. And service providers are on site. Security measures have started at that site. And next week, we will start with the process of getting ID badges for the members who are in there, and really ramping up the work to find significant housing options for the people that are in that encampment. So we're dealing with housing issues in the right-of-way in the short term and near term, as well as planning for affordable housing in that corridor to replace some of the housing that was lost to build this new corridor, and being mindful of the bifurcation that happened in that neighborhood previously. So I'll just leave it there to kick it off and see if Shar, others have more to add.
Well, I would say that the current availability of land or remaining land from the North Spokane corridor really is a testament to WashDOT's recent enaction of practical solutions. Without practical solutions, we would not have really looked at opportunities to reduce the footprint. It really pushed us into a path of saying, no, is there a better way to do it to meet the needs of what we know today? And so through that, available right-of-way was identified, and with through engaging communities, it was a clear no-brainer that affordable housing existed, and community members said, what about restoring affordable housing? And leveraging that idea also started a concept of what we call placekeeping. We knew that we were developing places in and around the North Spokane corridor. We've done it before. We've done that around I-90. When I-90 was developed, I don't know if many of you are aware, there were skating rinks and all kinds of facilities. However, there was not a steady revenue stream to maintain those places. We're doing a lot more in and around the North Spokane corridor than was done with I-90. However, it's being accomplished without a sustainable revenue stream for maintenance. So the coupling of all of these great ideas into this most recent legislation really is going to present an opportunity for community. And this is going to be a great test with our partners at Commerce, really, and Department of Health, to really have a community-centered initiative where community is determining how the available right-of-way that remains will be developed to meet the needs that they have identified. And so that process is being developed, or just under, starting with our partners with Commerce.
And take a moment and just add something on to what Sharkey was saying, because when we're talking about equity in this corridor, I think that that is another interesting piece when we look at access to the facility, i.e. on-ramps and off-ramps, and then how that footprint could potentially impact the neighborhood. And then we look at a smaller footprint that may make more right-of-way available for that community-driven housing and affordable housing. And we start to see that the idea of equity and environmental justice is deeper in this neighborhood and requires more strategic thinking and more conversation with this neighborhood about what they value, about what is important to them and what they want to see in their neighborhood, because there are some perhaps competing equity interests. And so I just wanted to bring that up.
I think that's a great point, Shauna, as far as trade-offs. And, we are across the nation, we're working with historic facilities, and we've already identified that these facilities are actually traversing or going through communities of color. And as much as we are moving away from being auto-centric, we have, for instance, in the Spokane area, we have an adjacent community that is growing, and their current primary means of accessing the Spokane vicinity is by car because of the lack of public transportation facilities for commuting. And as a result of that, if we were to be truly responsive to the auto-centric mobility needs, who would that impact? That would impact the very communities that have already been impacted historically. So at some point, to Shauna's point, that those trade-offs, that discussion really needs to be had with the community that potentially has the greatest impact being the focus of the decision, influencing the decision.
I just wanted to add to the two parts of the I-90 issue. So one, for those of you who aren't here, I just wanted to paint the picture a little bit. So this is east of downtown Spokane. WashDOT, in anticipation of how much land they would need, they bought blocks and blocks, full blocks of housing, and tore it down, and it's just empty like a wasteland along the freeway. And there were some legal technicalities that got in the way, since some of that land was purchased by gas tax, that we could only use it for transportation, yet we didn't need it for transportation. And also, as Shar mentioned, we needed a way to pay for the maintenance. And the way the accounting went is that all the money that would come in from leasing those lands would go to Tumwater, and it wouldn't be available. And so I just wanted to commend the leadership of the local Eastern Washington WashDOT folks who got practical, and then also wanted to commend our 3rd District legislators, Representative Riccelli and Ormsby and Senator Billig, because we all got together and basically said, let's figure this out. And the lemonade out of it is there's so much land available all in one spot that we can reimagine a whole neighborhood, not just a parcel or two. And we're talking about how do we develop this whole neighborhood, including the adjacent with the housing stock that could be redeveloped. And so that was creativity and leadership that accomplished that. And we had to get a bill through the legislature to do that, but that has now opened up that door to repurpose transportation lands for affordable housing in other communities throughout the state. So that's a new tool in the kit for people. And then similarly on the encampment that's called Camp Hope in the same location area, the obstacle before, originally less than 100 people were living there. But the city was afraid that if we did anything, then we might be liable. And WashDOT was afraid if they did anything. So we were arguing, our lawyers were arguing of telling the other one, you have to do something. And nobody would do anything. And the camp expanded to eventually 600 people living on a square city block with, no real bathrooms or garbage. And it's really a challenging situation. But now that leaders have stepped forward and gotten beyond the lawyers, now they've put up security fencing, there's ID badges, people are being given new housing options, the population has reduced, it's on its way to completely reducing. But it was, again, because of leadership and people coming together from all across the community on this one and getting past the political rhetoric. So it is amazing what can happen, even when the lawyers and the leaders initially say, nope, there's nothing that can be done.
We are close to running out of time, and I bet folks would have questions to keep us coming for another half hour or more. I want to turn to one that I think is an interesting one to think about for places beyond the urban. The Redlining Map of Spokane is on a website that when I look, it has 3 cities for the entire state. It has Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane redlining maps. And Rowena, you mentioned the environmental health disparities map has some information, but not everything that folks want. Do you or anybody else have resources to recommend for thinking about that historical context as a starting point, so they know at least some of the history as they start to have these conversations about what the effects of past projects?
Oh, that's a good question, Barb, because I'm so urban focused, and I will totally admit to that bias. And the EHD map doesn't really provide historical context in the same way that the redlining maps do. But part of me is thinking, though, that I'm assuming that rural communities have like archives or histories just like we do here. And I'm wondering if that is a place to start to get some of that historical context.
Yeah, I don't know.
I was just going to say, I think real estate covenants, counties and local jurisdictions have, pretty good, well-documented records of those discriminatory practices. So, whether that the ease to get those, maybe like Brienne might be able to share, because that, but I think that's one place to start.
Yeah,
I don't have an easy answer, but you might talk to your county auditor. They might. The auditors have all been discussing this issue lately, and it's been the subject of some legal battles out there. So I'm guessing your county auditor might have some information.
and I guess I would add that in addition to redlining, if all of us are living on land where people lived before white settlement came here, and understanding that history as well, and how were those tribal land boundaries set, and where did those major roads go through those, and where is somebody walking out of necessity, and it's a long way to get to anywhere, but that's what they have. That's part of the history of the state as well that you can look at. So that's one additional thought. Vicki is putting some information in the chat to remind us about our next sessions, and a session, I should say singular, one more in this great summit. I just want to thank everybody for having such a wonderful exchange, and Frank, and being part of this ongoing trust building effort to say what's going on and figure out how we're going to do better for ourselves and for the future, because we really have. With that, I want to thank everybody also for participating, and remember you can watch this recording again later or share it with others who couldn't be with us today, and take that feedback form in the chat.